Thank you, Barry. I'm now going to have to talk about Brexit. When I was trying to make sense of populism after 2016, I read a book called What Happened by Hillary Clinton. And I got to the end of the book and I realized that she still doesn't know what happened. In that, I use that as an example because our public debate about populism is utterly obsessed with short-term factors. Should I have gone to Michigan? Should I have gone to Wisconsin? What was written on the side of a bus during the Brexit campaign? What were Cambridge Analytica doing on social media? What politicians said what during which debate? And one of my frustrations with our discussion about populism, which isn't visible today, I think we're doing a great job of looking at the real drivers, but one of my frustrations with the broader public debate about populism is that we're still only really looking at the surface, and we're looking at the here and now. And one of the arguments that Roger and I make is that populism is rooted in some very deep long-term currents within our societies, and that populism is going to remain as a permanent political force on the landscape for many years to come. And I'll explain a little bit why we think that. But I wanted to start with a question that I'm often asked by people in financial services, which is when you look at things like Donald Trump and Brexit and populism in Europe, to what extent do these shocks signal that we are leaving a period of volatility, or do they instead signal that we are entering into a new period of churn and change? And that's a bit of a simplistic way of framing the discussion, but it does get us into some of the narratives that are visible all around us. If you think that we are leaving a period of volatility, then you buy into the arguments by Ronald Inglehart and Pippa Norris that you've just heard, that this is essentially about generational replacement. That if you read The Economist or you read the Financial Times, Martin Wolf likes this argument, Janan Ganesh likes this argument, that in essence this is about angry old white men who are about to be replaced by more liberal, ethnically diverse populations. It's a very seductive argument, particularly for liberals, because it means that we can reduce politics to simply being a conveyor belt of life. And we don't need to think about the actual grievances that are driving people to leave the mainstream. We can just assume that this is a waiting game. Another seductive narrative is that this is all about social media. And we conveniently forget all of the populist parties that were successful during the 1980s and the 1990s. I don't need to tell the Swiss about the popularity of ultra-conservative politics and how conservatism, and in some respects national populism, were popular long before we all had Facebook and Twitter. And obviously another narrative is this is just about the financial crisis, the European sovereign debt crisis, and the legacy of 2008, 2009. Doesn't do a very good job of explaining why we had very successful national populists in Austria and the Netherlands, two countries with very low unemployment levels, very robust economies. It doesn't explain why Nigel Farage first broke through in 2004 after 48 consecutive periods of economic growth, drawing much of his support from middle-class conservative voters. So I think there are lots of seductive things out there that the liberal left really wants to believe, because it fits with our priors, as David mentioned. But the reality from the evidence base that we're now putting together, and I think the reality from 30 years of research that we summarize in the book, is that the drivers are much deeper and far more complex. Take the generational argument as one. We have a very simplistic narrative emerging about Brexit. I don't think Brexit was a populist revolt. I think an element of Brexit was populist. But Brexit, if you really want to understand it, you have to understand the mainstream tradition of Euroscepticism in British politics, which came through both the Conservative and the Labour parties pretty much from the 1950s onwards. Brexit is fundamentally different from Donald Trump. It is a phenomenon that was really massaged within the political mainstream and was anchored in the formation of British identity that has going back to the work of Linda Colley and others in the early 1990s, has since the early 18th century been shaped by defining itself against continental Europe. If you look at the Leave vote, I wrote a previous book, Brexit, Why Britain Voted to Leave the European Union, with Cambridge University Press. The Leave vote was much more diverse than we often hear today. 1 in 4 graduates voted to leave the European Union. 1 in 3 black and minority ethnic voters opted to leave the European Union. 40% of London voted to leave the European Union. A large ethnically diverse city like Birmingham voted to leave the European Union. 40% of Scotland, a majority in Wales, voted for Brexit. The temptation to reduce that movement down to being a white working class backlash among older voters is very tempting, incredibly misleading. And if you look at the generational argument and how that's playing out across Europe, national populist parties typically, from Sweden to Italy to France, are not the most popular among the over 65s. They are often most popular among the middle-aged, or if you look at the latest work, for example, in France by Nonna Meyer, Marine Le Pen is now much more popular than her father among young women. She did very well among 18 to 24-year-olds. Matteo Salvini has no significant generational slant in his base of support. And I would echo Barry's point that if you look at the life cycle effect that is playing out across Europe, good friend and colleague of mine at Oxford, James Tilley, has done a nice paper on this, showing that typically all of us will become 0.96% more conservative as every year of our life passes. And that will basically take you a long way to explaining the generational difference that we see, for example, between Leave voters and Remain voters. So it's tempting to say, let's just hold on for 30, 40 years and all of this will disappear. The reality is that there is much more gas in the tank for national populism because it is connecting with voters, new generations of voters, that in their own way are feeling both economically and culturally insecure. The answer to the question is that it isn't economics without culture, and it isn't culture without economics. The answer, I think, as a majority in this room would share, is it is about how they interplay, how they combine, and at what level. And if I summarize some work we did on voting for Leave at the 2016 referendum, what we found there is, and altogether we've had about 15 studies of the Brexit vote of the last 3 years, and they all tell a remarkably consistent story. There were 2 key motives for Leave voters. The first was around sovereignty, that if you ask an open or closed question, consistently the most popular response was, I would like decisions that affect the United Kingdom to be taken in the United Kingdom. Whether you look at the British election study, whether you look at Lord Ashcroft's work, whether you look at YouGov. The second most popular motive was around freedom of movement and immigration. It was a desire to reform freedom of movement and lower the overall level of immigration in Britain and slow the pace of immigration. We have a very misleading debate around populism which says it is about people who want open societies versus closed societies. I think a much more useful framework is fast versus slow. And when you look at Leave voters, a lot of Leave voters accepted the positivity around migration, but wanted to slow the pace of that migration. And if you look at the 10 years before the 2016 referendum as an aside, Britain did see significant changes in net migration, which reached around 330,000 per year by the time of that referendum. But those 2 dominant factors, I would argue, for a specific chunk of the Brexit electorate, were underpinned by something else, which was really neatly summarized in the talk this morning, which is if voters felt that they had been left behind economically and socially, they then became much less likely to see Brexit as a risk, and those cultural drivers then kicked in and they became much more powerful to explaining why people voted to leave the European Union. So the way that I would describe it to my my students, for example, is I do believe that cultural insecurity is sitting in the driving seat when we want to explain populism, but economic insecurity is sitting in the passenger seat. It is a crucial foundation to laying the backdrop for how these cultural factors then kick in. And the generational argument, by the way, just to pick up on something else that Barry mentioned, I do think we need to also keep in mind the period effects that people are having. The average age of a Brexiteer was between 47 and 52. And if you think about what those voters saw when they were coming of age, this was a generation that grew up with Margaret Thatcher. It was a generation that grew up being told that Britain was signing an economic relationship, not a political and social relationship. And it was a generation that essentially came of age before the higher migration rates from 2004 and before the transformation of the British economy following the deregulation and privatization under the Thatcher regime. But now fast forward to my first-year students who started at university 2 months ago. My first-year students were born in 2001. They have no memory of September 11th. They have no memory of Tony Blair. They don't really remember the financial crisis. They've only known austerity. They've never known the good times. The first election they were eligible to vote in is about to arrive in December. They weren't eligible to vote in the 2016 referendum. They couldn't vote in the sequel, which was the 2017 election, because they weren't old enough to vote. This is a generation that has been an observer of the culture war, not an active participant. And that's a really important point, because for those students, the dominant priority is climate change. Of that generation, YouGov has shown us that only 49% want to see a second referendum on Brexit. About half. This is a generation that is not climbing the walls for a second referendum. If you go to a People's Vote rally in London, the group that want to campaign for a second referendum, you will be mainly surrounded by baby boomers. You'll be surrounded by typically quite affluent middle-class baby boomers. Their children, and Generation Z in general, are much more animated by environmentalism and don't see party politics as being a solution to those problems. And I think that's one of the fascinating dynamics about where we're headed in the future, in that the cultural backlash thesis, I think, leads us to expect that, in essence, the young are going to save us from populism. And I think it's important to remember that we now have generations coming into politics that are driven by a very different priority set and don't always look at traditional, conventional party politics as being the answer to that. I think if we're to move the conversation on to how we respond meaningfully to populism, I'll be provocative just for the sake of having a discussion and a debate later on. The first thing I think we need to recognize is that populists have very legitimate points. That if you look at the 4 key drivers that's behind populism, that if you look at distrust in politics, working class voters and non-graduates have very good reason to feel that they're not represented in the corridors of power because largely they're not. The reason that Brexit was so attractive to working class voters, the reason national populism is attractive to working class voters and non-graduates, is because they are now, relatively speaking, not in the corridors of power. If you look at the Houses of Parliament, only 4% of our MPs have any experience of manual work. 18% have only ever worked in politics. If you look at the US Congress, we've got more millionaires than ever before, more women, more ethnic minorities, but we've never had fewer people without university degrees or from a blue-collar background. The first thing we can think about, therefore, I think, is political reform. I think we need to think about how we can increase the representativeness of groups that rightly feel they're being marginalized within our political systems. 2 books I would recommend. One is Diploma Democracy, which is by some colleagues in the Netherlands that have shown how our European party systems have become much less representative. And the second is White Collar Government by Nicholas Carnes, which has shown how the way in which our political systems have become dominated by middle-class professionals has led to an exclusion bias in our policy process, whereby working class voters, low-skilled service sector workers have been marginalized in the policy-making process. There is a silver lining for those voters to populism, which is that they're coming back into the national conversation. And I think the second thing that we could think about is immigration reform. And we have to think about it. If you look at the response to Brexit, one obvious national conversation that we could have is, what concession will we make with Leave voters on migration? How will we reform freedom of movement? Boris Johnson wants to go to a skill-based policy. The Labour Party has said it doesn't want to reform this issue at all. And I suspect in December we'll find out the political implications of that decision. And I think very lastly, I'll leave you pondering a question which I always like to ask in these formats, which is, what are we willing to concede? Because somebody's going to have to make a concession. If you're on the liberal left, you're going to have to make some concessions around the economic situation, which, as the talk this morning showed quite powerfully, has marginalized a large number of voters. And also on the cultural dimension, you're going to have to think much harder about reforming migration systems. And if you're not willing to make that concession, then we'll simply have further polarization. And so what are you willing to concede? And I think that's the question that we really need to think about during our discussion. So thank you very much.